So I would like you to ask questions anytime you feel like it in the chat box, and mute yourself for now. Towards the end, everybody can unmute and we can talk. So this is a picture of one of my favorite places in the world. This is Point Lobos down by Carmel, where the Monterey pines and Monterey cypresses grow together. This is the only place where they grow together natively in a beautiful ocean. So both of those species have been planted around the world and extensively in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so I am Eric Folmer, and I have been working with trees here in the San Francisco Bay Area for more than 40 years. Here's a picture of me cutting eucalyptus back in 1980, and I have cut a lot of eucalyptus, and there's a lot of them left. So if I wanted to do that, I would do that every day, but no more. I am now a teacher at Merritt College, and I do some consulting and the tree climbing projects and tree climbing training. I had a small tree service in Berkeley for many years, very small, usually just one crew working, one dump truck, one chipper, container full of tools. And in my opinion, and I am sure I am biased, I think the best quality tree services are small. Once you get a certain size, it's more difficult to have the quality control. And often when you hire a tree service, the person who comes out to estimate the job for you is different from the person that does the job, and some of the details get lost in that process where they write a work order, they hand the work order over. So I recommend going with a recommendation from friends and neighbors for a tree service. Find out how they've been doing, and don't go too much by Yelp alone. Yelp is sort of hit and miss in my opinion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Canopy Research. When you go into the tropical rainforest, most of the life happens up in the treetops in the canopy. And going back in time, it was very little known, and they had no way to really studying it. So they came up with different methods. Like some guys would take a shotgun and shoot a branch down, or anything that moved and study it. Some guys would, like this guy here, they set out a net and then send up a cloud of poison, and then they study everything that falls in the net. So that's rather primitive. And then they've used balloons, they've used towers, walkways, and cranes to get up there. But now we have modern tree climbing technique and equipment, so it's much better to climb the trees and get up close and take a look at it. And that's what I've been doing. I started back in 2006 when I met some people that talking about this, and they caught my interest. I went down to the Brazilian Amazon, and I didn't really have any connections, or the connections I thought I had, I didn't have. But just by talking to a lot of people, I managed to get involved in some interesting projects. One was for a Brazilian government organization. We collected these seeds in the forest. These are seeds from a tree called Copaíba, and it produces a valuable oil. So by collecting the seeds, growing seedlings, and studying how to protect them from predators, they were able to make some money from the forest rather than just cut it down and run cattle there or grow soybeans. And here's one of my Brazilian team members, and here they are. They're setting a climbing line with a slingshot. Then I got involved with another project, which was to do a botanical inventory of a section of the Amazon that was very little known. And this was sponsored by the Kew Gardens in London. And this was my team, two botanists and two local guides. And we would go out in the forest. I would climb up and collect the leaves, fruit, flowers from the canopy. And then at nighttime, we'd sit and press them, and we identify them or send them off to a herbarium to identify it. So that was pretty interesting. That was a lot of fun. Since then, I've begun some project pretty much every year. And these are all places I went to in 2019 before the pandemic shut down worldwide travels. So I was in Costa Rica. I did some wildlife work in Borneo. I was in Peru, and I was in Madagascar, which was, also very interesting, very different place. And I work with eagles. I work with bald eagles in Michigan, and I work with East Bay. I work with golden eagles here in the East Bay. Actually, there are a lot of them in eastern Alameda County and Contra County. And that's an unfortunate place for them to be, even though they have lots of prey. That's why they're there. But there's also lots of windmills. So they tend to get accidents where they get hit by the windmills. And we are trying to study them to minimize that. So these are the type of things that I'm getting really excited about besides just the tree work. But I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the talk. But now I'll get to the subject of arboriculture. I'll talk about different aspects of the field, like planting, pruning, removals, tree health care, and tree risk assessment. And these tips I'll give you, it applies to whether you want to do the work yourself or whether you hire a contractor. If you hire a contractor, you can much better discuss with them what you need done and manage them. So I'll start with planting. And of course, if you want to plant a tree, you're going to decide which one to plant. And very important is how much space is there for the mature size. Too often we see trees like a redwood planted right next to a house. As it gets big and it'll expand diameter and the roots stress out, it'll start pushing on the foundation or the wall, and it becomes removal. And if that had been planned better, it could have had a longer life. So usually when I'm called out to look at a situation like that, my first recommendation is to modify the building. Which rarely happens, is usually tree removal. But once in a while, people will actually accept that, and they will go to the trouble to change the building to give room for the tree to live, and that's always good. So when you select a species, of course, it depends on what you like, what kind of look you want, etc. But also you want to consider what conditions it needs, and like looking at what is the native range, and so here is a couple of sources for information. Selectree is a website by Cal Poly. You can search for different species by different attributes you like, and it'll come up. You can compare, and then it will ask you, what is your sunset zone? What is your USDA zone? And it'll tell you what's a good tree for that situation. And there are a lot of books about trees. This one I like, and it's still in print. It's from 2007, and Grace put the link in the chat box that you can check what it is. Both of these. This book has a lot of trees, both native and non-native. It has palms, and it has the mature size and the estimated lifespan for each species, which is something most books don't have. There's not a lot of information. Lifespan depends a lot on conditions, but it's always good to know. So when you decide what tree you want, the next thing is to go to the nursery and pick up a tree. I don't recommend ordering trees and have them delivered. That's just nature of the business. They're going to give you the worst trees they have. They always have, because the way they're grown, there's sometimes they stay too long in the pots, and they're trying to get rid of them. So you want to go to the nursery and select them by yourself. That goes for any nursery. That's just the way the business is. So you want a tree that has low branches. This tree here has lower branches. It's not supported by a stake. This one is supported by a stake. It has no lower branches. The way they create this, they grow a seedling as a whip. It's surrounded by other seedlings, so it grows up fast to compete for light, and it doesn't develop taper. It doesn't develop lower branches, and then it's tied to a bamboo stake, so it doesn't need to develop taper. It'll go straight up like that. Then they tend to tip it out to create branching, and then you get too many branches originating in one point. So this is not a good structure. Of course, you always want to check the roots. Sometimes you can see the circling or kinked roots on the surface, but you want to dig down a little bit, because you can have circling roots when the tree was moved. If it was moved from a 5-gallon to a 15-gallon pot, in that interface between 5 to 15, there might be some problem. So you want to check for that. Okay, so this is a diagram, the best way to plant a tree. You want a really wide hole where the soil is excavated, so it's easy for the roots to expand. And here it says excavated and amended soil. Basically, in a lot of cases, you don't need to amend the soil. If you have decent native soil, it's better not to amend it, because with amendment, you're going to create an interface between the hole and the surrounding soil that's going to, impede water and root transition. And then you want to have a pedestal of structural soil that have not been dug up, that's solid, so the root ball will not sink. And you want the base of the trunk to be above the surrounding grade, like 2 to 3 inches. So here it slopes down to your grade. And the root zone is covered by mulch, not right next to the trunk. You want the base of the trunk to be exposed to the air, but further out, it's all mulch. And when you take the tree out of the container, you might see smaller circling roots right inside the container. Those you cut, get rid of them so they won't keep circling, so the new roots will grow out. And if they're small, that's fine. If they're really big, then you should have rejected that tree. As far as staking, you want to stake the tree as low as you can while it stands upright, and you secure the root ball. That way it'll have natural movement in the wind, and that'll help it develop strong wood. And typically after one season, you can remove the stakes altogether. It will have developed the strength in the root system to support itself. Okay, mulch. Mulch has a lot of benefits. It mitigates the temperature extremes of the soil. It conserves water. It adds organic material. And the process of microorganisms and worms and insects breaking down the mulch is beneficial for the texture of the soil. In addition, it adds organic material. So this is a study where they looked at how many tree roots are there under mulch versus grass. See, so mulch is a clear winner here. Tree removals. When you want to remove a tree, when I used to go out and bid jobs, I look at why is it being removed. It drops leaves, we get tired of cleaning it up, or whatever reason. If there's an alternative, or maybe sometimes I can just discuss it with people. I can say, well, you're going to have to go rake some leaves a few times, but look at the benefits, look at the shade you got, look at this and this and this. So, or maybe they want a view, they want clearance for something. Sometimes you can achieve that by pruning rather than removal and keep the tree. Then I like to advocate for using all the materials on site. The chips are great mulch, so you can have the contractor dump the mulch, spread them maybe, and consider milling the wood if it's a bigger trunk sizes. So here's example, a camphor tree that I removed for the city of Albany. So that's kind of unusual wood to have good sizes of. You don't have that many around. So this is interesting for woodwork. And with city trees, each piece is different rather than, the lumber at Home Depot, it's all supposed to be the same. But these have interesting characters, and you can use them for individual woodworking and projects. And then usually when you remove a tree, you also remove a stump. If you have a high intensive developed garden, you probably want to remove the stump because you want that spot to plant something else and to work with. If you have a more semi-wild area, you can just leave the stumps. You can cut them or cover them with mulch, depending on the species. If some species will sprout from the stumps and some won't. So if you're removing eucalyptus and you don't want to have them sprouting, you have to remove the stump or kill it with chemicals, which has other problems. And there's a few other ways of controlling the stump. But sometimes if it's on a hillside, you want to leave the stump in there because it helps stabilize the hillside rather than going in with equipment and grinding it out. You disturb everything. You don't have the roots all together. So that's just a consideration for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about tree health. A disease triangle is a disease is a combination of a pathogen, a susceptible host plant, and an environment that favor the conditions for the pathogen. If one of the three is missing, you don't have a disease. So most diseases and insects are opportunistic in a sense that they go to stress trees, especially the native pathogens go into a native tree. Typically, there's some kind of balance because if it killed its host, it wouldn't be around anymore. So, but the more aggressive pathogens are the introduced non-native ones. And examples are the Dutch elm disease, the chestnut blight, or the sudden oak death. And those have been introduced, and there is really still there's some resistance, but they create a lot of damage. The sudden oak death is when the environment is right for them, and they will just kill everything inside. So and a lot of times, if people ask me to look at a tree and it's doing poorly and it's diseased, a lot of times it's not a live agent, it's not a pest or a pathogen, it's an abiotic disorder, something that is not alive, that is too much water, too little water. So that's the first thing you look at, you consider. And then you consider the native range of the species. See, if the species is a riparian tree that grows by the rivers, and you plant it high and dry, well, it might be lack of water. If it's a mountain tree that's come from an area where it's high and dry and it needs good drainage, and you put it someplace where there's too much water and poor drainage, that's also a problem. So in this picture here, we have some coast live oaks in a park in Berkeley, and these are native to the area, so that's not the problem. But the problem is they developed with our native climate, with the long dry summers and the winter rain. So when you give them rain all year round, they tend to develop problems. They don't have enough oxygen, and the roots are susceptible to decay. So I'm going to give you just a few examples of abiotic disorders. So water deficit, here is a median on a street in Oakland. This is sort of on the route I drive a lot. So over the years, I've noticed trees being removed. There used to be a row of giant sequoias. Every year, one or two die and they're removed. Now there's a few left. Well, that's simply because there is not enough water for them. It's a limited root zone. And, we've had 2 dry years. Then we had 2 wet years, but then before that, we had a drought of 4 years. So it's been recently bad. And if you look at the native range of the giant sequoia, they get an average annual rainfall of 48 inches, which is about double what we get in Oakland. So they're stressed out on the normal weather. And then over here we have a little Norfolk Island pine. So I looked up Norfolk Islands. How much rain do they get? Well, they get about the same as sequoias. This is a wet island. So this tree is doing fine because it's young. It doesn't need that much water, but as it gets older, it'll get the same problem. So it'll have a limited lifespan. It'll reach a size where it won't have enough moisture. So the opposite problem, too much water. This is a Cork Oak, and there's a row of them were planted on a street in Albany, and they mostly look good, but one of them looked bad and is dying back from the top. So you can tell that the homeowner planted some plants right at the base of it, and no doubt they're watering it. So it's getting too much water. It's getting summer water, and also the soil underneath the pavement is going to be compacted. The drainage is slow. It's also known that Cork Oaks are native to Portugal and Spain, where they get the Mediterranean dry summers. Then this condition is not good for them. Planted too deep is another example of something you see too much. In this case, these ranges, they used a tractor to punch deep holes with an auger, and they stuck trees in there and they backfilled the hole. So this tree is like planted 3 years earlier, and it's not doing anything. It's just slowly dying, and there's no foliage. And you're looking at the base, you scrape away the soil, and the flare that you normally would see at the base of the trunk is not even there. When you see 2 parallel lines going down, it's planted too deep. And that happens a lot in mass plantings. A lot of times you would go to a parking lot with trees, and you notice they're same species, planted at the same time, same size, and some of them are doing fine, some of them are doing poorly. A lot of times you look closer, you'll see the ones that are doing poorly, you don't see a trunk flare. You see 2 straight lines going down, and they are too deep. Raised grade is another problem, and the trees don't like that. So this is a giant sequoia. So it's from the mountains. It needs good drainage. It's not used to having its roots covered like that. This particular tree was planted by John Muir at his house in Martinez. He took a sapling from the mountains and brought it down and planted it. And it was, you can tell by the taper and the sparseness, it's not doing well, but it's still alive. And it had a lot of fungus on the leaves that they would prune out every year. So the National Park Service, who manages the site, they decided that this tree is dying because of the microclimate is not ideal for it. And they took a little twig from the top and had it cloned. So they have the clone, and they're saying, okay, this tree is going to die, but we have the clone of the tree that John Muir planted. So that's all good. But I looked at that and I told them, I think this tree will do better because it's stressed out because of the raised grade. So I think it'd have more lifespan left in it if it's got some mitigation. Because I've seen, you know, good size full giant sequoias in Sacramento, for example, where it's even hotter than Martinez. So anyway, it took a while to negotiate this with the Park Service. You know, that they're like, well, who are you? And I said, well, this is what I like to do. Finally, they gave me permission. They wouldn't let me really lower the grades because it's part of the history, they claim. But I went in with a team of arborists, and we did, it's called radial trenching. Go in with an air spade, which is a tool that operates on compressed air, and we dug trenches out in like spokes in a wheel from the tree. We filled those with compost, and then we did a thin layer of compost on top. And this is a couple of years ago. The tree is already looking better, and I'm going to follow up on that. I like to do some more work and lower the grade some more. So that's the kind of stuff we do. I mean, just looking at the base, you see again, it's like a post in the ground. You see, you know, it's too deep. Another example of a grade was raised at UC Berkeley campus, where they have a lot of native oaks. They built this patio, raised the grade. They made a hole for the tree. Yeah, that's all good, but then it died. You know, it's the roots are covered up with soil, can't handle it. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about pruning, the terminology and the reasons for pruning. And this is whether you do it yourself or whether you're talking to a contractor. You might want to do the structural pruning of young trees yourself. This is from the ground or from ladders with hand tools, and then leave the climbing and chainsaw work to the contractor. So in general, pruning retards growth because it removes, stores energy, and reduces photosynthesis. And that's why it stresses out the tree. So there's a limit in each case where you cut too much and the tree is not going to recover. So that's one thing to be aware. Sometimes it looks like pruning invigorates the tree and you see a lot of new growth, which is true. It'll stimulate dormant buds to create shoots to try to compensate for the loss. But when you look at the total new growth, if you hadn't pruned it, the total new growth for that season, it would have been more. And when you prune, a lot of times you're looking at what's good for the tree, but you also look at what are the human objectives. You know, we need clearance for the, you know, big trucks on the street or something. Then you got to work with a compromise that's the best for the tree, the least damage to the tree to get that objective. And the earlier you participate, what's going to happen, the better you can do it. You can do it all with smaller cuts. The number of growing points removed is determined case by case. In our organization, International Society of Arboriculture, they used to have in the standards, you can remove no more than 25% of the foliage in one season. And some tree ordinances like the City of Oakland, City of Berkeley, they still have that in their ordinance. But they took it out because it is it is so much case by case that we don't want to have a fast rule to go by. Sometimes you can remove more, sometimes you cannot remove that much. And so the reasons to prune, let's just list various reasons here. Early structural pruning is typically when you plant a tree and you don't really prune it at planting unless there's a broken branch or something. You let it become established, you let it grow some roots, you wait a couple of years, then you do the early structural pruning. Then there's structural pruning of mature trees, risk mitigation pruning, clearance pruning, which is a lot of the tree work that happens in the city. Pruning for health is typically removing diseased branches. It cuts back on the inoculum, but it doesn't really change the condition why it's there. Then there's restoration pruning. If the tree broke in a storm or it was poorly pruned or pruned too much, then you have to restore a good structure by carefully pruning. Thinning for light, aesthetic pruning, and that, I noticed you mentioned Hakone Gardening, which is a great place. I love it there. And the aesthetic pruning is now become synonym with Japanese style pruning. So that is a detailed pruning for a certain look that is a whole field in itself and a whole specialty. Fruit trees is another specialty. Habitat is something sometimes you want a tree to provide habitat. This drawing is from a book by a German researcher, Klaus Mattek. He studied the biodynamics and the mechanics of trees and how wood develops. And he published some books. One book is this, Stupsy Explains a Tree. It's kind of a children's book, but it has a lot of good information in it too. For example, here, there is these compression bulges underneath the branch. There is a included bark, because there's a weakness here. So this is a sign that this branch is maybe a risk of failure. So Stupsy goes in and he reduces end weight and does mitigation. All right. How are we doing, Grace? Are there any questions?
Hello. Yes, there is one question from Allison, and it concerns an orange tree. Shall I go ahead and ask it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll read exactly what she wrote. Should I prune dead branches out of my orange tree?
Yes. In general, pruning out dead branches does not make a big difference. It's more of an aesthetic thing. So if you leave the dead branches in, the reason they died, depends the reason they died, but the whatever decay is happening is not going to move faster into the live part of the tree if the dead branches are there, because it'll create a natural barrier.
Okay.
So the first question would be, why did they die? So you'd have to take a good look what's going on. And also with orange trees, they tend to sunburn. You don't want to prune them too much, and that will the sun, if the sun hits the inside branches, that tends to kill the top of them.
Okay.
And
that's a good.
Yeah, typically oranges don't need a lot of pruning. Each fruit tree is different. There's a whole different way to prune them in order to get the fruit and be able to reach the fruit.
Allison continues and she asks, is there a lifespan for trees after which it is best to replace them? I think she's concerned particularly about, she says, my orange trees are at least 70 years old. She got a lot of fruit this year. And she said the Valencia, though, only gave 3 oranges this year after profuseness in the past years.
Right. So I don't know exactly the lifespan. I mean, but a lot of times a tree will produce extra fruit at the end of its lifespan. Sometimes you'll see a pine tree and it has lots and lots of cones. It's almost like, okay, my lifespan is coming to an end. I'm going to send out my seed right now. So I would keep them as long as they produce, and I can't give you a lifespan. I would Google it. I'm sure in the commercial, orange business, they probably have a cutoff point where it's producing less, so tear it out and plant another one. But for a tree like yours, you can decide when it's declining too much.
I've noticed in fruit trees that sometimes you'll have a boom buster year and then you'll have a scant year, and it kind of alternates.
Yes, and a lot of trees do that. The oaks do the same. They call it a mask year when there's a lot of acorns.
Right.
And so yeah, that's probably has something to do about their survivability of the species, defenses against predator. In a mask year, the predators can't eat all the fruit. So
right. There's a few more questions. Should I ask them now or later?
Yeah, go ahead.
Judy says, is Pistas Chinensis really resistant to oak tree fungus?
Yes, as far as I know, somewhat, but almost all species will get it if they get poor drainage, and the right conditions. So the armillaria is one of the fungus that'll go to pretty much anything. So some are more or less resistant.
Sue asks, Given the drought, what is the recommendation for watering trees such as redwoods that don't naturally grow in our area?
I would soak the whole root zone once a month and soak it to a depth of 2 or 2.5 feet. But all
Wow.
the roots that absorb water are going to be near the surface. You don't water right next to the trunk, but you want to saturate the soil, and then you want to leave it long enough to dry out. So you want to do it maybe once a month. You want to check when you water it. You can check by see how deep it's saturated by if you take a rod or an irrigation flag that's long enough and poke into the soil. If it goes down easy, that's how deep it's saturated. Drainage you can check by digging a hole and filling it with water and see how fast the water disappears. If the water stays there for days, then you have poor drainage, and that's not a good thing. But yeah, no, for redwoods, you are in Los Altos, you are close to native redwoods, but you know they definitely need more water in a year like this. Okay, let me go over some of these pruning cuts. So
All right.
there's a certain terminology involved that if your contractor you're working with, if they are certified arborists, they will know these terms and they will understand what you're talking about. So a reduction cut, that reduces the length of a branch or stem. It takes the biggest piece and leaves the smallest piece. And the recommendation used to be that this should be 1/3 the diameter on this. And that's a good rule of thumb, so to speak, but it's also very much case by case how much you can cut. If this one is tiny, it's not considered a reduction cut. It's considered a topping cut because this one is not big enough to take over as the new leader. Then you have removal cuts. And that means removing a branch to the trunk or removing a secondary branch to a primary branch. And this is the best way to make those cuts. I'll get a little bit more into that later. So if it's dead, you make a cut outside of this collar that's live. If it's live, you preserve this collar, you preserve the ridge, prank bark ridge, and you make a cut like that. So you have, those are the two main cuts. Then we also talk about shearing. Shearing is when you just like a hedge shear, you cut through every leaf and twig. And that's good for like hedging a topiary. But sometimes if you have a big hedge, it's actually better to do selective pruning rather than shearing, because shearing will create a green layer right at the surface, and then the whole inside will be dead. But if you selectively prune and open it up, the inside growth will stay alive and you'll have a better structure that way. So it depends on what kind of hedge you have. Another cut, as far as defined, is topping. Topping cut is just straight across a branch or a trunk, not having a big enough side branch to go to. So that is something that we don't want to do, no topping. For young tree training, what you look at, this is an example here of, you look at the lowest permanent branch. If you want, eventually don't want any branches for 8 feet, then if you have them now, you'll leave them on there, you tip them back to slow them down. But you don't want to just remove them now. It's going to slow down the whole growth. It's going to expose the trunk to too much sunlight. So you keep them, but you keep them small until the canopy above are big enough to take over and shade the trunk. Taper, rapid taper is good. If you have a long, slender branch, you reduce it to increase more side growth, increase the taper. And you look at the vertical and circumferential distribution of branches. Not everything should be originally the same point. You want spaced out. So typically, like this tree, you choose a leader. This is the central leader. These two were taller, but you don't want that. You want that leader to be the leader. So you reduce these, and this is called subordination. And aspect ratio refer to the fact the size of the main leader and the side branch is the ratio of the side branch being half the diameter or smaller is good. If they approach the same diameter, is a poor structure. So even if you have a tree that eventually will be a multi-trunk, you still want to start out with a main leader that's a little bit bigger and longer than the other ones. Here's a little video where I'm looking at a tree and deciding what to prune for early structural pruning.
So I'm taking a look at this young tree for structure. It doesn't have any broken branches or wound. It looks kind of crowded at the top, and it has some lower branches, which is good. In this case, there's plenty of room, so it might not need clearance. If it does need clearance for some reason, then you would leave these lower branches on for now. They're pretty small. Later, you would tip them out, and much later, you would remove them. Looking further up, here you have two codominant stems and a third one coming off right here. And especially these two about the same. Looking up, they are crowded each other. So you decide which one you want to be the leader. In this case, the central one's going to be your leader, and you remove this one. This one here, you can either remove or subordinate. Either way, the tree can handle it. A young tree, all sapwood, it can handle cuts. But what you look at is what else is there. So looking up, there's not a lot of other branches there. So in this case, I would subordinate it. When you subordinate a branch to get a better aspect ratio, you need to make sure you remove enough growing points to really make a difference. You can't just tip it out. In this case, I would probably cut it back to here and then tip this one out, and then this part will fill in, these will fill in. And then looking at the angles in the union down here, the angles, this angle is good. The bark is turned up, that's a good thing. And you have an upright here with a aspect ratio that is approaching half of the parent stem. So it's another one you want to subordinate for that reason, and also for the reason that it is competing. You want to subordinate this one. There's not much else there. You could cut it back to here or here.
Okay, so that was young tree pruning for structure. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about this guy, Alex Shaiko. He did a lot of work that changed practices in tree care. He's known as the father of modern arboriculture. And he studied decay inside wood, and he's the reason we want to make those cuts where we cut outside the collar, where people used to, before his studies, they used to make flush cuts and cut too close. So he spent many decades as a scientist working for the Forest Service, cutting up trees and studying them inside and looking at the advancement of decay. And he put some myths to rest. So I went and studied with him in New Hampshire back in 2004. And we looked at a lot of pieces of wood, and we looked at the wood inside microscope to see how that works. And he came up with this concept called compartmentalization of decay in trees. When the tree is injured and it gets pathogen and rot coming in, it will compartmentalize it. It'll create walls to stop it. And there's a constant battle between the two forces, depending how healthy the tree is, how aggressive the organisms are. And he called them wall 1 through 4. So wall 1 is the weakest, wall 4 is the strongest. So wall 1 stops the decay going up and down the trunk. Wall 2 resists the spread going inwards across the growth rings. Wall 3 stops the spread over the rays, and 4 is the new wood that's created after the injury. So as this wood is growing, it reacts to the injury and it creates a really strong barrier. And here's an example of a cypress cross cut. You can see how the decay went in from a pruning wound, and it moved a lot faster up and down than across the rings. And the reason for that is that the branch and the wood, the way they grow, they are sort of interwoven and connected. So this light stuff is trunk, and this is the branch. So if you move the branch like this, you don't injure your trunk. If you make a flush cut like that, you make a big wound that as an entry into the trunk. So that's why we have these cuts. Cut 1 and 2 is just to take the weight off so it doesn't tear. And then, like we looked at before, cut outside the collar. If there is no visible color, like on some species, you make a cut outside of the branch bark ridge at an angle like that. As another example of this is one of Shaiko's pictures. If you make a flush cut here, that's a no. If you make a cut out there, that's a yes. And this is an old flush cut where you can see the discoloration moving up and down. The new wood, the diameter at the cut blocks it, and this illustrates how that works, how coated works. So when you make a good pruning cut, typically you're looking at a circle. If you made a bad cut as a flush, you would look at an oval. So this is typically how it's going to look. And going back, 30 years or so, people always said, don't leave any stubs, make it flush. And then, well, they realized that's not the best.
Hey, Eric,
Yes.
you're at 50 minutes now from when we started.
Okay. All righty. Wow. So I might have to speed it up a little bit, but I'm going to go over some of these concepts here. Pruning for clearance, a lot of pruning for clearance that we get in this area, and I'm sure you have that in your area too, is view. So here is an example of a redwood where if you top a redwood, it's bad for the structure. So if you cut it's next best thing is to cut a window through it. And this is a picture that after the homeowners negotiated how to open it up, the owner of the tree and the uphill neighbor. So they sent me this, remove these branches to clear the view. So this is kind of a job we used to go back and do every year. The tree is naturally going to fill in the window. We keep the window open. That's fine. Then if you have a tree with a more rounded crown as opposed to redwood, then you can keep it small. Here is a buckeye and a coast live oak that we used to prune every year just to keep it out of the view. And we do it every year. You make small cuts and you keep a lot of live crown. If it's neglected and not done for a few years, then it's harder to bring it down. Sometimes you have to do it over 2 seasons to make sure there's still some life, because all the new growth will be up too high. So I'll go a couple of pruning no. So here is, like I said, flush cuts. We don't do anymore. Somebody had the wrong idea here. And this is an illustration of what flush cuts will do. This is a valley oak, and 2 big branches broke, and they hammered this house pretty good. So they asked me to check it out if this tree is going to be too high a risk to keep it or to remove it. So I went in, I checked, this is called a resistograph. It checks the extent of interior decay. And I found a lot of decay going up and down these big limbs right over the house. So unfortunately, it was a removal. But here, there's a big flush cut that probably done 30 or 40 years ago. And you can see it hasn't closed. And the edges here is all hollow. And as the decay came in, and there's another couple of flush cuts on the other side, and the decay all connected, and it became columns with very little sound wood left. Another no-no is topping, like I mentioned. This is what happens. Sometimes you top a tree and it dies. Sometimes you top a tree and it will resprout. And then you will get decay from the pruning wound, and you get this regrowth that's poorly anchored. And then when these get tall and they get hit by the wind, they break out. They have very little anchoring, so you ruin the structure and create a hazard. Over pruning, unfortunately, sometimes this is a beautiful Japanese style pruning, and I love Japanese style pruning. But you take a Japanese black pine that's native to an area where you get summer rain, and you put it in our Mediterranean climate, it might not be able to take that much severe pruning. And I don't know the story. I'm not trying to pick on the pruner. This may be that the staff on site forgot to water it or something. So anyway, for something like that, you have to be very careful, because the Japanese style pruning is sometimes taking it right to the limit. You have to really know, and you have to keep up the care. Lion's tailing, that refers to the fact that you remove all the inner branches and you just leave a tuft of green at the end, like it looks like a lion's tail. So this is a Douglas fir I noticed a few years ago. Last time I went by, a lot of these branches have died, and whatever is green has not grown very much. So this tree is creating a hazard and not very healthy. So I'm going to give you a few examples of tree risk assessment, some conditions we look at. Bark inclusion is when the tree comes, when parts of the tree, two trunks come together and they are not united, then this is all bark that's squeezed in right here, this black stuff. So that becomes a weak point as this gets heavier and gets hit by the wind and rain. There it goes. Trunk decay, of course, is another condition of concern, and the history of failure of the tree and of the group of trees is an indication of a future risk. Also, when you see gap in canopy. So I will quickly talk about those. Another example of a bark inclusion failure. Here was bark inclusion. This whole thing came down and nailed the car. So if that had been noticed, that could have been mitigated with some pruning, reduced weight, maybe cabling. So when you see a gap in the canopy, if one big branch is coming down, that's an indication of risk. So this particular tree is an Italian stone pine. Then they went in and reduced end weight and pruned it, and now it's a lot safer. But being a stone pine, it would not create new inside growth, so this had to be maintained in the future. So interior decay, if you have a pocket of rot in a tree, the tree will create extra wood on the outside to make up for the weakness, and that's visible by a bulge. So here is a liquid amber. You see a bulge on this side. Looking at the other side, there's a big cavity, and that's why it's bulging. It's creating extra wood. And sometimes you can really read a tree, and then you want to determine how much sound wood is there. Sometimes you have to check it, drill into it with a resistograph to decide if you can keep it or remove it. Armillaria and Ganoderma are mushrooms that decay the wood. When you see these, this is an annual cluster of honey-colored mushrooms. You see those at the base of the tree, or you see the Ganoderma, which is a perennial conch on the trunk. You know there's a lot of decay inside, and you have a problem. I talked about having a gap in the canopy. I came by this tree. I see there's a gap. Came back later, and that whole part is gone. So looking over the fence, I can see that, well, this is another typical thing. Here's what was left. And here is a bark inclusion, all this black stuff. Moon tree. So there is a redwood that the seed was put on the Apollo 14 mission and sent to the moon and back. The idea being, you know, we're going to study if this tree now grows differently. It was planted up at Tilton Botanical Garden. It didn't really grow any different, but it grew well. It's probably 120 feet now. One of the gardeners noticed that it has two tops with a narrow angle. This is a weakness. So if you leave that alone, eventually one of them will break out and you will have a one-sided top with a big wound. So they asked me to remove one of them. And I went up there, took a good look. I left the one that has the most wood, and I cut the one that has the least wood. And this being a redwood, this will still be alive. It will sprout from there. And this is a couple of years ago. Now it's looking good. It has a balanced top and not just the branches on one side. History of failure. Here was a ponderosa pine that uprooted during a storm in Piedmont in 1991. And we went up there to clear the road for the city. As we were doing it in the middle of the night, another one of the trees in the same row fell, and we had to run to not get hit by it. But this was an extreme storm. This was like 100-mile-an-hour gusts after a series of rainstorms, so the soil was saturated. So since then, none of them failed. So that doesn't mean that these have become an hazard. It means they're extreme conditions. 25 years later, the row of them is still there. But the reason trees fail is because they have a built-in safety factor. If the tree wanted to be 100% safe, it'll have a little pyramid shape and a tiny canopy. You know, it's not going to fail, but it won't be successful. Well, this guy gets up in the light, gets to photosynthesize, gets to spread its seeds so the species can be successful and carry on. And that's why we have the safety. And this is something we can, having trees around houses, we can mitigate that. We can notice what's going on and we can reduce the risk. Another way of pruning is creating habitat. This tree was a Monterey cypress. It was leaning over a driveway and it was partially uprooted. You can see the whole root ball was turning. So I cut the top off and I roughed up the top cut so it looks more like a natural break, and it has more of a surface for microorganisms to colonize it. Then I cut out a section and I made a hole and I put that section back in with a hole as an artificial cavity for a cavity nesting bird. I did that last summer, and sure enough, this spring there was a little bird, Beaver's wren, moved in. So I'm glad it worked. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about my other canopy and wildlife work. Is there any questions at this point?
There's a slew of questions.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to go through them now? I can also go through the rest of my slides, and then we can address them.
Okay. Are you guys okay in general, the audience, with it running for a while? And if you need to come off, you can, because this is all being recorded. So I think
okay to go. Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
Let's see. Reducing an avocado to make sure the fruit is in reach. I guess I'm looking at online, and that's something that is done. Eric, do you have any additional comments about that?
Yes, a lot of times fruit trees are pruned to be able to reach the fruit. So I would say do it in winter and don't expose the inside branches to the hot sun. So
And it's something that's best done also when the fruiting tree, including avocados, are younger.
yes, absolutely. So the earlier you prepare for the ultimate size you want, the better it is. If it's much bigger than you want it to be, you're going to have to reduce it in stages. You're going to have to thin the top, reduce it some, but leave some growth up there, and then come back the next season, go all the way down. Otherwise, it's too drastic and it's opened up too much.
Somebody says, when do we remove the remaining oranges from our orange tree?
The remaining oranges? Oh, you mean when they?
Yeah, how long should you leave the fruit on the orange tree, I guess?
You mean when they dry up and becomes like mummy fruit?
I think you
No,
removed.
before that.
Yeah, like there a bunch of fruit that are still on our tree, and we've been eating them for months. And so I still have some left. So I guess my question is should I start pulling them all off?
I would just pick them when you want to eat them. They will stay good for a long time.
I've done that with mine too. I simply leave the oranges and the grapefruit both on the tree, and go more by the outside texture. If they're really, really shiny fruit when they first come out, then you want to not leave them on there until they get too dark and too coarse looking, because then they're going to be too fibrous.
Right. That's a good point.
Mary Smith says she worked with Dr. Greg Asner at Carnegie Institution. And have you ever worked with him in Costa Rica or the Amazon?
I have not. What is the institution?
Carnegie Institution, but the scientist's name is Dr. Greg Asner.
No, I don't know him.
Okay.
Uh,
Let's see. There is something about a plum tree that has been prolific with fruit, but not one blossom this year. And why would that be? I think we sort of discussed that a bit.
Right. There's, they change it a lot year to year.
Right.
So it might
Sometimes
come back
a
strong
big-
next year.
Yeah, a very heavily fruiting year will be followed by very little because the tree has expended its energy.
Right.
Also, how far do redwood tree roots spread?
They spread about as far as they have good growing conditions. So they can go out. They go out much further than the so-called drip line, the outside of the canopy, because it's such a narrow tree relatively. So I would say they can go out 50 feet easy, and they tend to follow the top, the top of the soil. They tend to stay in the top 2 or 3 feet of the soil.
Yeah, I found that they're kind of aggressive and they'll steal water from other plants.
Right.
I have some questions about redwood trees. Can I ask that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I live in Los Altos Hills. We have quite a few redwoods in our house, in front and back. I think they're pretty old trees, but they're all looking kind of sad. They're getting brownish. The top looks kind of dry. We are watering them once a week for half an hour. But you're saying once a month?
Yeah.
Water it for So I don't know whether they will survive because they keep all the leaves are falling, kind of brownish, turning some of them. Not all the tree is brown, but a lot of tree the leaves are falling. So kind of sad looking. I don't know what to do.
Yeah, so if you water for half an hour, you're not going to really put a lot of water in the soil. You're not going to penetrate deep enough.
Wow. So we have to water it for an hour, maybe?
Yeah, well, the way to check, you have to check the soil. And do you have a sprinkler system, or do you put out a portable sprinkler? How do you do it?
No, we do. We have sprinkler system for all other trees, but not for the redwoods.
Right.
So we are leaving the hose on in between the trees, leaving it on in between the redwoods.
Yeah, and that's good. I just let it trickle, let it saturate. But you might, if you dig down or you poke down, you might be surprised that you're not penetrating the soil very deep. Also there's going to be, do you have lawn near the redwood?
No, we have some ground covers, ivies.
Right. Yeah, so that some of the ground covers and lawns have pretty aggressive roots, so they might get the majority of the water rather than the redwood. So if you replace the ground cover with mulch, that's better for the redwood.
Oh, I see. Oh my gosh, they're very pretty looking ivies around.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's always a trade-off there. And,
yeah.
There's another question about a 60-year-old fruitless mulberry. It had been healthy, but a few small branches have died. Does it need water?
Most likely they are relatively drought resistant. So it depends if the tips die back all around, that is a water deficit.
Yeah.
And also you're going to get branches dying. If branches die that are shaded out by other branches, that's not so much a concern. It's more like if the top and the outside shoots are dying, then that's a water issue.
And then another person has a neighbor with a acacia tree planted too close to the fence. And I guess.
This is Ann Schultz.
Yes, is that on your property or it's
right next to my fence? It's huge now, and I hear that acacias have very bad roots. I need to talk to my neighbor. Can you give me a professional opinion?
So the roots are invading your property?
Well, they will, I'm sure. It's right. It's a huge tree, and I think acacias have bad roots. Is that correct?
They have aggressive roots, and they reach out to get the water, and I'm sure they're already on your property.
It is a bad tree, correct, to have next to your house?
Well, it depends. It's
huge.
It's a non-native. They have a relatively short lifespan in our area.
Oh.
And it does tend to dominate. The problem is you cannot cut too many roots on your side. That can be a problem because that can damage the tree. So
I'm going to have to talk to her, and I wonder how can I put it. It's just huge, and it's covering our. I can talk to her about the shade, but I can't cut the roots. Okay. Right,
but I mean, there's been some court cases about that. There's a.
Oh well, I don't want that.
You don't want that, no. But you want to work it out, and it may be finding a way to live with a tree, but you cannot cut the roots anywhere near close to the tree. You could cut some roots further away from the tree, maybe, but they used to say whatever is over your property you can cut. Well, there was a guy that actually cut a bunch of roots for a pine tree, and he got a judgment against him. Had to pay a lot of money because he ruined the pine tree. So you got to be careful with that.
What if you prune all the whole roof, the tree down a bit? It's so tall on my side. Does that make a problem to the tree because it's so high now? What if you prune back the branches? What are my chances?
Oh, the branches. Yeah, the branches, you can prune branches more than you can roots because the roots will, it's going to really impact the health, and it's going to destabilize the tree. Maybe it'll fall over if you cut too many roots. But
you can be dramatic on the tree branches, right. Can you?
But the branches is, you can remove some branches that are over your property, and you negotiate that with the with a neighbor. Of course, the tree climber needs to go on your neighbor's property, needs permission to do it. So you kind of have to negotiate how much to cut,
Right.
and don't imbalance the tree too much, and don't cut like too much at one time. If you want to cut like we said earlier, 25% of the leaves, you don't want to cut that much.
Okay,
You
well,
wanna
thank you.
still select if you take the biggest branches that bother you.
I have to be very diplomatic.
Right. Oh yeah, neighbor situations can be tricky.
Thank you.
And there's another question about the ginkgo and if it's resistant to oak root fungus, and which plants actually might be resistant, because this person's yard is full of it.
The ginkgo reputation, let me think, other than that, I can't really give any good recommendation that's something that's resistant. I would say oak root fungus is a native fungus. It's going to be everywhere, and it's going to be prevalent if the soil stays wet and if roots are a lower trunk are injured. So whatever you plant, I would plant it on a little mound so it drains away from it. As far as resistance, I'm not sure. I would go to the CalPoly website and see what they say in there. And it's the oak root fungus is generalist, so it will go to all kinds of species. It will even go to deadwood if you can't find live wood. So it's more a question of a conditions you have.
I think we've covered most of these questions. Somebody had a question about, can you tell when you cut into a tree if it's been diseased? And I answered that the tree actually never heals and it walls off the diseased part. But Eric probably has some more eloquent way of saying.
Right. Well, I'll add to that. If you cut into a tree, if you see green, it's alive. If you see brown, it's dead, because that is, the cambium right underneath the bark. Sometimes it's hard to tell, especially when it's dormant. Do you want to,
But generally, you wouldn't cut into a tree unless you had a good reason, because each cut you make is a wound and a possible entrance for disease.
Right, exactly. Sometimes you cut into something in order to have it diagnosed by a lab and see what organisms are there. If you have a problem, that's a whole other thing. Yeah. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about my wildlife work if we have time.
Yeah, go ahead. I think if people need to go, they will, and they can see the end of this talk when I put the recording up on our channel.
Okay. Sounds good. So this is a golden eagle, and right now is the nesting season. So I'll be going out in a few days and visiting some more eagles. And this is probably 8 weeks old, and they get pretty big before they fledge. But there are, as long as you grab their feet, the talons is their weapons. So if you hold on to the feet, they're pretty mellow. They settle down. And here's a story of one eagle. We put a transmitter at it at 8.5 weeks old, and then we follow the tracks from the transmitter. It went all the way down to the Traverse Ranges. It went to San Luis Obispo and hung out for a while, and then it came back to the Bay Area. And then all of a sudden we noticed it wasn't moving. The location was the same several days, and we knew there's a problem. So we went out and found it, and it had been hit by a windmill and broken a wing. We took it to the Lindsay Wildlife Museum, where they managed to cure it and it healed, and they were ready to release it. So that's a good thing. That's what it's all about. And these studies, the long-term reason for these studies is to find out how better to design and how to place the windmills so there's less injuries to birds. So here is some places where I went to traveled in 2019, just before the pandemic shut down my project. So I'm now waiting to go out again, plan some things. But I went to the Peruvian Amazon, this area called Madre de Dios, and this is borders to Brazil and Bolivia. And it's pretty wild and remote, and there are still so-called uncontacted tribes out there. It took like took like a day of driving down from Cusco to get to the Amazon, get to a river, and there's a sign, beware, there are isolated tribes, and they are not really uncontacted. The reason they are hostile, they don't like outsiders, is because they remember what happened. They were contacted during the rubber boom 100 years ago, and they were treated very badly, and they were killed and made to be slaves to collect the rubber. So now they don't want no visitors, which you can't blame them. So they're still out there. And there's a lot of pressure now with that, where there's more access. So there's illegal logging and gold mining and stuff. So it's a tough situation. But this one research station out there, somebody had been there, and they put some motion detector cameras up in the canopy of the trees, and they had this solar panel to power them, and they were supposed to send a signal to an antenna. They'll send a signal to another antenna so they could go on a computer and they could see it. Well, it never really worked, and somehow the people that put it up were not involved with them anymore, and they needed me to find these cameras and bring them down so they could rework them and see what's going on. So that was kind of interesting. I walked around the forest with binoculars because there's so many vines and epiphytes and stuff, and I found these cameras one by one. And the reason I have this net over my head is when I climb in an area like that, I have this little net on my climbing saddle, and I came up to one of these cameras, and on the branch underneath it there was a wasp nest. So the wasps had built their home there, and they were flying around. So I put my head net on. I moved very slowly and carefully, and I managed to not get stung. I sent those cameras down, and they could work on and reprogram them. So that was an exciting trip. It's a totally strange area. If you ever saw a film called Fitzgeraldo by Herzog, that is based on a story of that area where this rubber baron, he brought a ship over a hill to get in there to get rubber back, like in around 1900. And then after that, I went to Madagascar, and this is, we call it the Ants and Canopy Boot Camp. So I trained some Malagasy biology students and some American graduate students that we brought over there, how to climb and how to collect ants. Every time you do that, you will find new species of ants that have not been described by science. It's like a whole new frontier. So that was interesting, and we've been waiting to get back. We wanted to go back. We postponed it a couple of times. Now the plan is to go back in January. So right now, Madagascar is closed for entry. So it all depends how it goes. But other than that, it's that the island has an amazing wildlife, the lemurs, the baobab trees, everything is very unique and endemic. So we camped out in the forest, and we made some deals with the local villagers. They bring in waters like this every day, and we use that water for our little makeshift showers. And then there were these two emergent baobab trees in the forest we found. So we spent the day, just everybody climbed, got to the top of those and to look out. So that was pretty cool. But this was the view I had from the trees. This is a slow life, and these are the rice paddies. It's way away from everything. But then when I got back on the grid to civilization, I had an email. Can I come to Korea? So that was like right from Madagascar, back here, turn around, go to Korea. So now I'm like in a modern city. I'm trying to figure out how to take the subway, looking at this. And they wanted me to teach a seminar and do some consulting about trees. So I did we call it visual tree assessment workshop, and looked at some trees, and that was pretty interesting. And looking at trees there, they have a lot of ancient practices similar to Japanese style pruning. But one thing they do is they value the old trees, but then when they get old and get a lot of decay, they will gouge out the decay and fill it with concrete. And this is a practice that, was popular in this country back in the 1960s. That's one thing that also Alex Jikers found out, that's not a good thing, but you see that a lot in Korea, and you see some. So I'm trying to bring modern arboriculture to them without dismissing the ancient traditions they have. They have a lot of experience, but certain things are not working that well. Anyway, I go to Michigan also, and I work with bald eagles. So these are some bald eagle babies. When I work with the golden eagles, they have to be they have to be a bit big for me, but the bald eagles, what this is for, this is a study to test their blood. And this study has been going on every year since the 1960s. And this was instrumental to creating the ban on DDT and the Environmental Protection Agency and the Endangered Species Act, because they found out about the DDT was ruining the eggshells, and there was a lot of it in the blood of the eagles. So now there's other contaminants they're finding, but at the lowest back in the late 60s, there was about 30 nesting pairs of bald eagles in Michigan. Now there's like 850 they know of. So in that sense, a good success story. And sometimes when I got out there, the adult eagles would hang out, or they fly around and they make noises. So surprisingly, they never attacked me. I don't know why. And the wildlife biologists could not really explain it, why they wouldn't attack me, but so far so good. So, that is, here is a, Rachel was a biologist, and there's some baby eagles. I've been going to Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, I built these canopy platforms for the Organization of Tropical Science in one of their stations. And that was fun. We had to design it, carry it back into the forest and set it up. So this is a big emerging oak tree. And if you're interested in that whole project, it's there's a YouTube video called Into the Canopy that you can search and find it. And then I do these tours to Costa Rica, usually once a year. I had to skip a year because of the pandemic, but we go to different locations, we climb trees, and we watch wildlife and have a good time. Here is a large tree, a ceiba, in a watermelon field, and we saw this tree from the road, and we go, wow, beautiful tree. And we go ask the farmer, can we climb this tree? Oh yeah, no problem. So I'm like, yeah, well, it's Costa Rica. Can you imagine California? It'll be like, no, liability. But I went back, my last trip, I went back over New Year's. And here we climbed into those platforms on New Year's Day with my group. And they're all having fun, even though it was probably slightly hungover, it being New Year's Day. Maybe that wasn't the best timing. But here is down in the near the coast, in the coastal rainforest. We climbed another ceiba tree. And so this tree we actually measured. We drop a tape measure from the highest point. So this is how big they get. These are emergent trees that are taller than other trees in the forest, so 174 feet tall. And here I have a group of people. They tend to grow straight up and then spread. So here I have a group of people hanging out at the top. And in that area, it's called the Osa Peninsula, Corcovado National Park. We see a lot of wildlife, the tamandua, anteater, the tapirs. And then some years we go to this festival in an indigenous village called Baruca, and it's called the Fiesta de la Diablitos. So the tribal people, the Spaniards usually call them the Diablitos, the little devils, because they're the heathens, right? And the Spaniards are the Christians. But so they took that name and said, okay, we are the little devils. But they have this festival where they, for 3 days, the little devils fight a bull. The bull symbolizes the Spaniards, and they all drink a lot of homebrew beer and get drunk, and it's a big scene. And then the bull is winning at first, but then towards the end of the third day, they beat up the bull and burn it. So it's quite a spectacle to visit. And then also Costa Rica is so varied that from the coast we go to the highlands, where there's a spectacular oak forest, the cloud forest. There's a huge oak trees. Here I am at the base of one of them, setting a rope. Here are some friends of mine, like 100 and some feet up in one of the oak trees. And it has so much going on in the canopy that it's like a garden with mosses, orchids, bromeliads, lots of things. And here's my friend coming up. You're looking at some of the bromeliads. So he's kind of funny, my friend Walt. He used to have a nursery and a plant shop years ago. So he's looking at these plants. Some of them are plants that he used to sell. He's going, oh, look at that. Here's $60. Here's $80. So here's my friend Valerie. So we would just get in hammocks and hang out and be quiet. Then sometimes we see this beautiful bird, the quetzal with the long tail feathers. We hear them and then they land near us. So it's spectacular. So I do tree climber training. I do these short courses. If you need to learn tree climbing so you can work on your trees or just for fun, for recreation, you can take one of my classes. You send me an email. And my Costa Rica tours is put on hold because of the pandemic, but I'm thinking I will maybe have one coming up in December. It's all to be determined. So thank you for having me. I'm sorry I went a little bit over. Please give me more questions.